Hey guys, tonight we are going to dive deep into one of the most tumultuous stories of love, power, and tragedy in English royal history. The story of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn. On a fateful morning at the Tower of London, Anne Boleyn, the woman who risked everything to become queen, stepped out of her chamber to face her destiny. Just a short walk from her was the razor-sharp blade of an executioner, summoned by the king as a final act of mercy for the woman he had once risked his entire kingdom to marry, but whom he ultimately believed had betrayed him. The stormy relationship between Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn is cloaked in romantic legend, historical hyperbole, and well-worn cliches. Although we all know how this tragedy concludes with an execution, do we truly understand what brought them together, what powerful forces sustained their bond, and what ultimately and mercilessly tore them apart? So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Please leave a comment below and let me know where you are in the world and what your local time is right now. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. Anne Boleyn awoke in the royal apartments of the Tower of London on the crisp morning of May 19th in the year 1536. The grey light crept through the narrow casement windows as she stirred in her gilt and velvet bed, every breath heavy with premonition. Her ladies-in-waiting moved quietly about, their embroidered kirtles whispering against the cold stone floors as they laid out the simple garments she would don for the day's grim purpose. Anne rose slowly, the silk slippers at her feet catching the dim glow of a single candle. Each movement, the smoothing of her coif, the adjustment of her kirtle's brocade, felt deliberate, a small ritual to steady a heart that thudded with both dread and a strange, sorrowful calm. This final journey would be brief and mercifully swift. Within the hour she would walk from her chambers down the narrow staircase to the scaffold in the Green Tower. Green prepared by an executioner, renowned for his flawless skill with the razor-sharp blade. He had been summoned only days before from Paris at the personal command of Henry, King of England, as a last act of mercy for a wife he had once loved fiercely. The man's identity was whispered to be Jean Rambeau, a master swordsman whose reputation for precision spared many a noble from the agony of an axe. Anne had no illusions about the grim theatre awaiting her. She understood that only the blade of a master could grant her the dignity her station now demanded. The narrator invites us into a sober re-evaluation of the storied lives of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn lives. Long cloaked in myth, romantic legend, half-truths, and scandalous exaggerations. Over the past 500 years, chroniclers and novelists alike have painted Anne as both saint and seductress, Henry as both tyrant and tragic hero. It is said that history is written by the victors, but in their case, the victor was never truly their own story. The author pledges to strip away the accretions of myth and to follow the faintest traces of contemporary evidence, letters, household accounts, vestiges of Anne's personal possessions to reconstruct their true characters. Why did Henry, perhaps the most powerful monarch in Europe, surrender his heart so completely to Anne? And how did that same passion fuel the circumstances that would end her life on the scaffold? These questions loom large as we begin our journey in the gentle countryside of Kent, where Anne spent her formative years among the rolling fields and orchards of the Boleyn estate. Hever Castle, the family seat, stands today as a relic of her childhood, a half-timbered manor surrounded by a calm moat. It was there that Thomas Boleyn, her father, served as an ambassador to the French court and counsellor to Henry VII, ensuring that Anne's upbringing was one of privilege and rigorous education. She learned French fluently, studied the classics, and delighted in the latest scholarly debates imported from the continent. Yet personal letters only a handful survive hint at a free spirit unbound by convention, a young woman whose intelligence and wit were matched by her piety and refined taste. It was this combination, worldly sophistication laced with devout faith, that first captivated Henry VIII in the early months of 1526, more than 4 years after Anne had returned to England from Paris. He was in his 30th year, a strapping figure of more than 6 feet in height, renowned for athletic prowess and charismatic charm. Yet behind that sunlit facade lay a monarch tormented by the absence of a male heir. The Lady Catherine of Aragon, his first wife, had borne him several children, all of whom died in infancy or were stillborn, save for Princess Mary. Henry believed that his failure to produce a son was divine retribution for marrying his brother's widow, in violation of Levitical law. When he encountered Anne, whose very name had become synonymous with the heraldic motto, Veni, Vidi, Vici, or I came, I saw, I conquered, he perceived in her not only the promise of romantic love, but also the potential answer to his dynastic prayers. Thus, our story begins not with the lofty splendour of Westminster Abbey, but in the half-dark corridors of the Tower of London, where a doomed queen faces the culmination of power and passion, romance and political intrigue. From the Kentish orchards to the flip of a razor blade, the lives of Henry and Anne unfolded with breathtaking intensity. Over the next several chapters, we will piece together their journey. The moments of whispered longing, the dispatches in gilded caskets, the theological debates that severed ties with Rome, and the final, irrevocable act of state that sealed Anne's fate. In doing so, we will seek to know them not as caricatures of villainy or virtue, but as flesh and blood individuals whose intertwining stories reshaped the course of England and whose echoes linger still in the silent stones where Anne took her last steps. Anne was born at Hever Castle in the spring of 1502, the second of 3 children to survive into adulthood in the distinguished Boleyn household. Hever Castle, situated amid the gentle Kentish countryside, had been the family seat for generations, its half-timbered walls and moat reflecting the status of the Boleyns among the gentry of Tudor England. Her father, Sir Thomas Boleyn, was a man of considerable influence, a member of the King's Privy Council under Henry VII, and later the English ambassador to the court of King Louis XII of France. Her mother, Lady Elizabeth Boleyn, née Howard, came from the powerful Howard family, ensuring that young Anne's lineage was rooted in 2 of the most prominent dynasties of the realm. Anne's elder sister, Mary Boleyn, was born in the autumn of 1501, and her younger brother, George, arrived in the summer of 1504. The 3 Boleyn children grew up under the careful supervision of their parents, who spared no expense in providing their offspring with the finest education available. In the great hall of Hever Castle, Mary might practice needlework by the light of a flickering torch, while George learned the basics of horsemanship on the castle's practice yard. Anne, with her keen wit and restless energy, was soon recognised as a spirited pupil, equally fond of music, languages, and the study of classical literature. Under Sir Thomas's guidance, Anne's education was both rigorous and cosmopolitan. At the age of around 11, she and her sister Mary were sent to the Netherlands to serve in the household of Margaret of Austria, the regent of the Habsburg Netherlands. There, Anne absorbed the refined manners and courtly etiquette of the Burgundian court, practiced her French until she spoke it as fluently as her mother tongue, and studied Latin grammar and rhetoric under learned tutors. After 2 years, she transferred to the French court of King Francis I, serving as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Claude of France from 1514 until 1519. In that splendid setting, Anne witnessed the height of Renaissance culture. She attended poetry recitals in gilded chambers, learned to play the lute and harpsichord, and observed the theological debates sparked by early reformers. By the time she returned to England at about 17 years of age, she was not only well versed in European languages, French, Latin, and some Italian, but also familiar with the latest advancements in art, theology, and courtly behaviour. Despite this privileged upbringing, Anne's personal correspondence is remarkably sparse. Only a handful of letters penned in her delicate hand have survived, leaving historians to piece together her character from household records, ambassadorial dispatches, and contemporary accounts. It is through these scattered traces that we glimpse her reputation as vivacious, intelligent, and unfailingly courteous, yet determined in expressing her own views. The few extant letters suggest she addressed her father with deference, commending him on his diplomatic successes, and wrote to her mentors with a mixture of humility and confident curiosity. Among the precious few artifacts that bear Anne's personal inscription is a lavishly illuminated Book of Hours, rendered in the workshop of a Flemish master around 1520. This prayer book, now preserved in a London collection, features gold leaf borders and miniature scenes of the Passion of Christ. In a margin beside the depiction of the resurrection, Anne herself inscribed the prophetic words in her neat script, "Le temps viendra," the time will come. Below the image of Christ rising from the grave, small faces cluster at the tomb's mouth, evoking both the anticipation of the Last Judgment and perhaps a more earthly hope for her own destiny. The inscription is dated neither day nor year, but its placement amidst devotional imagery underscores Anne's piety, a trait sometimes overshadowed by later scandal and political intrigue. The Book of Hours also reveals the rhythm of Anne's spiritual life. The canonical hours marked out in gilt lettering, from lauds at dawn to compline at nightfall, echoing the disciplined structure of her daily routine. It reminds us that, though she would later be cast in the role of a courtly seductress, Anne's inner world was suffused with devout reverence. Her faith would remain a constant companion, whether in the opulent chapels of the French court or within the austere chambers of the Tower of London. Thus, Anne's childhood and education combined the solidity of an illustrious lineage with the breadth of continental learning. She emerged from Hever Castle not merely as a daughter of privilege, but as a young woman equipped with languages, musical skill, theological awareness, and the instinctive poise of a courtier. Yet beneath those accomplishments lay the seeds of the enigma that historians continue to puzzle over. How would this free-spirited, devout, and well-educated daughter of Kent come to shape and be shaped by the tumultuous reign of Henry VIII? As we consider the slender volume of her prayers and the corridors of her childhood home, we sense the first stirrings of a destiny both extraordinary and, in time, tragically brief. We often remember Henry VIII in the final years of his reign obese, ruthless, feared by many, but the young king who came to the throne in the summer of 1509 was an altogether different figure. Standing 6 feet 2 inches tall, well over the Tudor average of 5 feet 7 inches, Henry presented a striking silhouette in the court's candlelit corridors. His shoulders were broad, his limbs muscular from years of vigorous exercise, and his stride carried the confidence of a man in full command of his body. Reports from contemporaries describe him as possessing golden hair that caught the light like a halo, and a round, handsome face that seemed, a Venetian envoy declared, more fitting for a beautiful woman than a stern monarch. His eyes, set beneath an arching brow, were said by Erasmus of Rotterdam to shine, as though the sun itself rose when he spoke. Henry's prowess in sport and martial arts was legendary from his earliest days as sovereign. He bested the finest archers in England in contests at Hampton Court, demonstrating an accuracy that seemed almost preternatural. He excelled on horseback, mastering the art of the joust, and winning renown for his skill in tournaments held each Michaelmas. His enjoyment of courtly tennis, played in narrow brick courts near the palace, was such that foreign envoys wrote home with admiration, noting that his strokes were elegant and forceful in equal measure. The combination of physical prowess and genial charm made him one of the most popular young monarchs of Europe. Yet beneath the veneer of youthful vigour lay a growing burden. Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon, solemnized on June 25th, in the year 1509, just 2 days after his coronation on June 24th, was initially one of affection and respect. Catherine, the widow of his elder brother Arthur, was nearly 27 at the time of her wedding, while Henry was but 17. Their union produced several pregnancies over the next decade, but tragedy followed each birth. A son born in the first year of marriage, Henry, Duke of Cornwall, lived for just 52 days, passing away on February 22nd in the year 1511. Other children were stillborn, or lived only briefly, their tiny lives marked in the royal registers as fleeting hopes. In February of 1516, Catherine gave birth to a daughter, Mary, who survived to live into adulthood. Yet in the politics of Tudor England, a female heir was viewed as a precarious solution. A princess would likely marry a foreign prince, potentially bringing England under unwanted external influence. Henry's failure to produce a male successor weighed heavily on him. He interpreted these losses through a theological lens, convinced that divine displeasure had been visited upon him for marrying his brother's widow, a direct contravention, he believed, of Leviticus chapter 18, verse 16, which forbade uncovering a brother's wife. Prelates and theologians in his court confirmed his fears, citing Leviticus chapter 20, verse 21, which warned that such unions would render the couple childless. Henry took these passages as literal proof that his legitimate male heir had been denied by God himself as punishment. The king's introspection deepened as he read the works of reform-minded scholars. He saw in his own predicament evidence that earthly authority, even his own, was subordinate to divine will. This conviction fueled his later break with Rome, but in the years immediately following his marriage, it simply intensified his obsession with securing the dynasty. Each miscarriage and stillbirth became not just a personal tragedy, but a blow to England's stability and to Henry's sense of self. His jovial countenance began to darken, and the affable young king who once captivated foreign ambassadors grew increasingly driven by an inner torment that only a surviving male heir could assuage. Yet in those early years, Henry remained outwardly the shining prince. He presided over lavish feasts in the banqueting hall, danced with grace at masked balls, dispensed generous gifts to his courtiers, and maintained a courtly decorum that balanced seriousness with revelry. His laughter rang through the corridors of Greenwich Palace, and his benevolence was noted in the annals of household accounts, where payments for tournaments and gifts to the poor appeared alongside sums allocated for royal banquets. Even as his private grief festered, Henry understood the importance of projecting strength and magnanimity to his subjects. Thus, the paradox of the young Henry VIII emerges. A man of striking physical prowess and magnetic charm, beloved for his generosity and love of sport, yet haunted by the conviction that he had transgressed both divine and natural law. His inability to sire a male heir would come to define his reign, setting him on a collision course with theology, Rome, and ultimately with Anne Boleyn herself. But in these formative years, Henry remained the radiant prince, a figure of beauty, vitality, and princely grace, whose later descent into tyranny would be all the more tragic for the promise it once held. We often think of Henry VIII as he appeared in the final decade of his life. Corpulent, ruthless, merciless, but the obsession that would come to define his reign began long before. Haunted by his failure to sire a male heir, Henry came to view himself as a man under divine punishment for marrying his brother's widow. His theological advisers cited Leviticus 18, verse 16, which declares that one shall not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife, and Leviticus 20, verse 21, warning that, if a man shall take his brother's wife, it is an unclean thing. They shall be childless. In Tudor exegesis, childless was understood not merely as barrenness, but as the absence of a surviving son. This interpretation struck deeply at Henry, for he had endured 6 pregnancies with Catherine of Aragon between 1510 and 1517, yet only one child, Princess Mary, lived beyond infancy. Every miscarriage or stillbirth seemed a fresh confirmation of divine displeasure, strengthening Henry's determination to prove that his first marriage had been nothing more than a mock vow. While Henry wrestled with sacred law and royal duty in England, Anne Boleyn, still in her teens, was forging her own destiny abroad. Around the age of 11, in the autumn of 1513, she journeyed to the Burgundian Netherlands to serve in the household of Margaret of Austria, the regent at Mechelen. There, Anne learned the courtly arts of diplomacy and deportment, mastering Flemish customs and honing her facility in French. After 2 years, in the summer of 1515, she transferred to the glittering court of France as a maid of honour to Queen Claude, wife of King Francis I. Queen Claude had married Francis on the 24th of May in the year 1510, inaugurating a court renowned across Europe for its blend of piety and patronage of the arts. Between the years 1511 and 1518, Claude bore 7 children, 3 of whom were male heirs. Francis, born in the early months of 1516, who would later become Duke of Brittany. Henry, born in the spring of 1517, styled Duke of Orleans, and Charles, born in late 1518, destined for a high ecclesiastical career. Claude's success in motherhood stood in stark contrast to Catherine of Aragon's tragic losses, and Anne observed firsthand how the Queen combined devout religious observance with the rigorous demands of court politics and motherhood. Life at the French court was neither licentious nor gloomy, but a constant interplay of ceremony, faith, and cultured leisure. The court chapel at Château de Blois echoed with solemn masses, while the galleries resonated with lute music and poetry readings. Anne attended these events in silken gowns embroidered with the fleur-de-lis, learning to navigate the subtleties of court intrigue, when to bow low, when to approach with measured confidence, and how to offer conversation that was both witty and deferential. She took lessons in rhetoric and debate from humanist scholars, studied the works of Erasmus and Marguerite of Navarre, and even discussed theological ideas in the Queen's private salon. Yet, despite the court's sophistication, Anne never saw it as a place of unbridled sensuality. Rather, it was a realm where devotion and decorum coexisted, and where education in the classics was as vital as proficiency in the latest dance steps. During these formative years, Anne's piety deepened. She was known to rise before dawn, to say her prayers, to read devotional texts in the Queen's gallery, and to take communion with a solemnity that impressed even the French clergy. At the same time, she flourished in the more worldly aspects of courtly life. She learned to wield a rapier in feminine fencing displays, to compose verses in both French and Latin, and to sing chansons with a clear, resonant voice. Her reputation grew as that of a young woman, both devout and delightful, a paradox that would later intrigue Henry VIII himself. By the time Anne departed France in the summer of 1519 to return to England, she was no longer a mere girl of the Kentish Boleyns, but a cosmopolitan courtier of rare refinement. She spoke with confidence in 3 languages, played 2 instruments with skill, and carried herself with a grace that bespoke both noble birth and continental polish. The 10 years she spent abroad, first in the Netherlands, then in France, had tempered her into a woman of complex temperament, equally at ease in the hushed glow of a chapel and the brilliant pageantry of a royal court. In that transformation lay the essence of Anne Boleyn, a figure shaped by faith and sophistication, whose blend of sacred and secular qualities would both captivate and unsettle the man who sat on England's throne. Returning to England in the year 1522, Anne rejoined the Tudor court at Hampton Court Palace, entering a world governed as much by ceremonial pageantry as by political calculation. The court's retinue consisted of approximately 200 gentlewomen attending Queen Catherine of Aragon and nearly 1,000 men-at-arms and servants serving King Henry VIII's household. Every morning the scarlet and gold banners were raised above the palace towers, signalling the resumption of courtly business. The King's Council met in the presence chamber, while ambassadors and courtiers exchanged confidences in the painted galleries. Tudor court life was a careful balance of solemn ritual and indulgent festivity. At dawn, courtiers gathered in the chapel royal for matins and mass, kneeling on worn rushes as the priest chanted in solemn Latin. By mid-morning, the king's gentlewomen would assemble in the great hall for privilege, a display of fine dress and etiquette, their elaborate underskirts and kirtles of velvet and satin, reflecting Henry's desire to project majesty. Afternoon entertainments might include a pastime of falconry on the palace's east lawn, or a bout of real tennis in the narrow brick court nearby, where the ball flew like a comet over the high-walled enclosure. Yet alongside this piety and formality, the Tudor court was imbued with a sense of libertine exuberance. Feasts featuring roast swans and peacocks in their plumage were followed by masked balls, where courtiers danced the pavane and galliard beneath glittering chandeliers. Masques, elaborate theatrical productions, combining music, poetry, and allegory, took place in the painted chamber, often celebrating royal anniversaries or diplomatic milestones. Through all this, the role of the courtly lover was institutionalized. Henry VIII, like a living emblem of kingship, was expected to embody both sovereign authority and romantic allure. His choice of mistress was thus a political as well as personal statement. The more captivating the lady, the greater his prestige. Among the many noble ladies vying for Henry's favour was Mary Boleyn, Anne's own elder sister. Mary had already caught the king's eye in 1520, and for several years she occupied a discreet yet influential position as his mistress. Her presence lent the Boleyn family an entree into the inner circles of power, but it was Anne's subsequent arrival that would transform the dynamics of courtly romance. Anne returned to England with an education and poise unmatched by many of her contemporaries. Fluent in French, trained in singing and lute playing, skilled in dance steps imported from the continent, she carried with her an aura of European refinement, rarely seen in English court circles. When Anne stepped into the great hall at Hampton Court for her first audience, it was said that her bearing combined the dignity of a princess with the delight of a maiden. Her gowns were cut in the latest French style, her sleeves slashed to reveal embroidered chemises beneath, and her hair, though covered by a modest hood in keeping with Tudor taste, was arranged in soft rolls that hinted at her foreign sojourns. Courtiers whispered that she spoke of theological debates and quoted lines from Petrarch's sonnets, a novelty that piqued Henry's curiosity more keenly than any display of wealth. By early 1526, Henry's fascination with Anne had grown into a resolute attachment. He began to compose love letters in an unusually intimate hand, dispatching them with tokens that carried layered meanings. Among the more curious gifts was a small gold whistle pendant, studded with emeralds and fashioned with a tiny spatula and ear spoon, a personal hygiene tool carried beneath the court mask. The inscription attached read that if Anne whistled soft, Henry would answer straightway, a playful yet earnest metaphor. Her summons would be his command. Anne's responses, though less numerous, were measured and discreet. She acknowledged the king's affection in carefully worded phrases, pledging her loyalty and hinting at a deeper bond yet to be formalized. In one surviving phrase recorded by a mutual confidant, Anne wrote that Henry's heart would find in her both solace and steadfast devotion, a subtle promise that foreshadowed their later determination to wait for a marriage of greater consequence. Throughout this period of courtship, both Henry and Anne exercised caution. The king's desire for a legitimate male heir made any premature union politically complex. An offspring born out of wedlock would carry no dynastic weight. Anne likewise understood that her position hinged on more than personal affection. She must become queen if she were to give Henry the son he so desperately sought. Thus they played a careful game of letters and liaisons forged in secrecy, yet charged with the knowledge that history had never witnessed such a union. In the quiet corners of Hampton Court, beneath the watchful eyes of courtiers and counsellors, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn laid the foundation for a love that would shake the very foundations of church and state. After many years of anguished waiting and bitter disappointment, Henry VIII resolved to end his marriage to Catherine of Aragon once and for all in order to wed Anne Boleyn. Yet in the early 1530s, England remained a steadfast member of the Roman Catholic Church, and every question of royal marriage required the Pope's blessing. Henry first petitioned the Holy See for an annulment in the late year of 1527, arguing that his union with Catherine, his brother's widow, was unlawful in the eyes of Scripture. For months, envoys carried briefs to Rome, only to return empty-handed, for Pope Clement VII faced political pressure from Catherine's nephew, Emperor Charles V of the Holy Roman Empire. Frustrated and desperate, Henry sought an alternative path. His attention turned to the writings of William Tyndale, a reform-minded scholar who had published The Obedience of a Christian Man in 1528. In that seminal work, Tyndale asserted that the supreme authority in matters of faith belonged not to the Pope, but to the Bible itself. He wrote that the king is judge over all persons and causes within his realm, elevating Scripture above papal decrees and empowering secular rulers to govern religious affairs. Anne Boleyn, quietly sympathetic to reformist ideas, presented Henry with a copy of Tyndale's book, inscribed with a simple endorsement, "If you are head of the Church, then you hold the power to command all things therein." The gesture, though understated, emboldened Henry. It suggested that he could claim spiritual jurisdiction, as well as temporal sovereignty. Buoyed by this intellectual support, Henry reaffirmed his own title of Defender of the Faith, a distinction originally conferred upon him by Pope Leo X in the summer of 1521 for his Latin treatise against Martin Luther. Now he embraced the irony of that honour, interpreting it to mean he must defend the true faith by reforming the Church of England from within. Thus began the sequence of reforms that historians later dubbed the English Reformation. On the 25th day of September, in the year 1534, Parliament passed the Act of Supremacy, receiving royal assent to declare that the King's Majesty justly and rightfully is, and reigneth over this realm, as its only supreme head in both things temporal and spiritual. From that moment, Henry assumed the title Supreme Head of the Church of England, severing formal ties with Rome. The act also required all clergy and royal officials to swear an oath of loyalty to the monarch's supremacy, a demand that placed many bishops, abbots and parish priests in mortal peril should they refuse. Within the following 2 years, from the autumn of 1536 through the summer of 1538, Henry authorized the dissolution of the monasteries, a program that saw nearly 800 religious houses, monasteries, convents, and friaries suppressed, and their vast lands and treasures seized by the crown. Royal commissioners, dispatched across the counties, inventoried church plate, manuscripts, and lead roofs before ordering the monks and nuns to vacate. By the close of 1539, the revenues from these seizures had bolstered the royal coffers by an estimated £200,000, an astronomical sum that funded Henry's military ventures and lavish court entertainments. This sweeping assertion of royal authority achieved two immediate objectives. It removed a key source of papal influence within England and provided the financial means to sustain Henry's political ambitions. Crucially, it also cleared the path for Henry to marry Anne Boleyn in the eyes of his own realm, even if the Pope's excommunication remained in effect. The private devotion that Henry once channeled toward Catherine was now publicly redirected to the institution of matrimony with Anne, and the legal framework of the English Church was rewritten to accommodate it. On the 25th day of January, in the year 1533, shortly before the Act of Supremacy, Henry and Anne had already contracted themselves in a secret marriage at Whitehall Palace. To contemporaries, this clandestine union seemed the culmination of the great matter, the monarch's decades, long campaign to secure a legitimate male heir. Yet the true magnitude of Henry's decision lay not only in his personal life, but in the transformation of the entire religious landscape. In severing ties with Rome, Henry unwittingly set England on a revolutionary course. A century later, the state church would evolve under Elizabeth I into a distinct Protestant tradition, and the concept of national sovereignty over ecclesiastical affairs would become a cornerstone of modern governance. Thus, the divorce from Catherine of Aragon and marriage to Anne Boleyn transcended the realm of royal romance. It was the catalyst for a redefinition of spiritual and political authority. Private love ignited a public schism, forging the Church of England from the crucible of dynastic desire. Henry's choice to embrace Tyndale's theology and to enact the Reformation laid the foundation for centuries of religious and governmental structures unique to England. In that choice, the fates of Henry and Anne intertwined with the destiny of a nation forever changed by their union, one that began as a quest for personal fulfillment and ended as a revolution that reshaped Christendom. In the cold grey of December, in the year 1532, Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn embarked upon a small vessel at the port of Dover and crossed the chilly waters of the English Channel to seek an audience with King Francis I of France. The Channel's waves lapped softly at the hull as the pair, attended by a handful of trusted gentlemen, made their way toward the glittering court at Versailles. It was a journey made in secrecy, for word of their diplomatic mission could tip the balance of European opinion. Yet Henry moved with a quiet confidence, born of desperation and resolve, and Anne, clad in a dark velvet gown trimmed with fur, showed no sign of doubt as she stepped onto French soil for the first time since her girlhood years at Queen Claude's court. Versailles in December was both austere and splendid. The palace's timbered galleries stretched under a pale winter sky, and the stones beneath the feet of ambassadors and nobles glowed with the warmth of countless torches. King Francis received his English counterpart in the Hall of Mirrors, though it would not earn that name until decades later, where tapestries of crimson and gold depicted scenes of chivalry and divine providence. Francis, himself no stranger to the currents of religious reform surging through Europe, greeted Henry with princely courtesy. He spoke in measured French of the importance of a stable Christendom, and he listened intently as Henry laid bare the plight of his realm. That his marriage to Catherine of Aragon had failed to produce a male heir, leaving the English succession imperiled in the eyes of both God and man. By the 25th day of December, Christmas Day itself, Francis had offered Henry and Anne a token of support, a subtle diplomatic gesture rather than an explicit guarantee. He presented them with a ring set with a single sapphire, inscribed with the words, "Spero exemplar justitiae," I hope for a model of justice. Courtiers whispered that this was a signal to Rome that the French crown would not obstruct the King of England's quest for annulment and remarriage. In the corridors of Versailles, this seal of approval was understood as both a personal favour and a statement of continental solidarity with England's reforming ambitions. With Francis's discreet endorsement, Henry and Anne returned to Dover in the gloaming of January in the year 1533. The journey home was as quiet as their departure, but Henry felt an unfamiliar lightness in his chest. He believed that, with France's sympathy, the Pope might yet be compelled to relent. More immediately, he and Anne prepared for the consummation of their union, no longer as secret lovers, but as husband and wife, in the eyes of the Reformed English Church. On the 25th day of January in 1533, within the great halls of Whitehall Palace, then the largest royal residence in all of Europe, Henry and Anne were married in a ceremony conducted by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. The event was deliberately understated. No grand procession, no chorus of trumpets, Only the hush of candlelight and the presence of a handful of bishops and royal chaplains sworn to secrecy. The arrangement was intended to avoid further offence to Roman Catholic sensibilities. Even so, the news spread swiftly through London, carried by whispers in the taverns and notes slipped between the pages of merchant accounts. Almost immediately after the nuptial rites, news reached the court that Anne was with child. The announcement came in early February, when physicians assigned to the Queen's household confirmed her pregnancy and recorded that she was several weeks along. The prospect of a royal fetus conceived by the man who would soon claim supremacy over both church and state electrified the realm. Across the countryside, parish priests read the king's proclamation at the close of Mass. Anne, my lawful wife, shall bear the seed of the realm's hope. In the capital, printed broadsheets still a novelty in England, declared that the crown's true heir was now on its way. Henry used this pregnancy to fortify his public arguments. He declared that his marriage to Catherine had been cursed by heaven for barrenness, while his union with Anne was blessed by God in its fruitfulness. The king's great matter, his decades-long struggle for annulment and remarriage, had transformed from a private anguish into a matter of state import. Europe's major powers now took notice. The court of Charles V, Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire and nephew to Catherine, studied the implications for the balance of power. Spain's council pondered whether to realign alliances, and even the Curia in Rome felt the undercurrents of coercion emanating from London. Thus, a matter that had begun with whispered letters and clandestine meetings had become an international affair of unprecedented scope. Henry and Anne, once merely lovers, were now at the centre of a diplomatic storm that would reshape Christendom. Their private bond, consecrated at Whitehall's quiet altar, had ignited a conflagration that would redefine the ties between monarch and pope, kingdom and church, and above all, between love and authority in the turbulent court of Tudor England. On the 23rd day of May in the year 1533, Thomas Cranmer, Archbishop of Canterbury, convened the Court of Arches in London and issued his definitive decree. In solemn Latin pronouncements, he declared the marriage between Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon to be null and void, citing the prohibition in Leviticus 18, verse 16. Thou shalt not uncover the nakedness of thy brother's wife, as the biblical mandate rendering that union unlawful. By Cranmer's authority, that bond was declared void ab initio from the very beginning, and in its stead he formally recognized the marriage between Henry and Anne Boleyn as lawful and binding under the Church of England. Only 9 days later, on the 1st day of June, Anne Boleyn was crowned Queen of England in Westminster Abbey, the venerable site of royal coronations since the reign of Edward the Confessor. The ceremony, conducted according to the rites of the newly established English Church, was austere by the standards of continental coronations, yet magnificent within its own context. The abbey's soaring Gothic arches and ancient tombs echoed with the strains of plainchant sung by the newly appointed dean and chapter. Anne, robed in a gown of cloth of gold and ermine trimmed in Tudor green, knelt before Cranmer as he placed the coronet upon her head. There was no papal blessing, no serenade of trumpets from the Vatican, only the voice of the English Archbishop, pronouncing her Queen Consort of this realm, under the supreme authority of the Crown. In the days that followed, London was arrayed in celebration. Banners of yellow, white and black, the heraldic colours of the Tudor dynasty, draped the facades of noble houses and the battlements of the Tower. The stately procession wound through the city's narrow streets, led by the king astride a white charger, followed by Queen Anne in a gilded litter, and attended by earls, barons, and bishops in their ceremonial robes. Along the route, commoners lined the sidewalks, many taking the day off from their trades to catch a glimpse of the new queen. Shops closed early, and alehouses set out extra barrels in anticipation of the revelry. This public pageantry marked a moment without precedent, a royal wedding and coronation determined wholly by the decisions of an English sovereign and his council, independent of papal dispensation. The spectacle was transmitted to the populace by heralds on horseback, who carried official proclamations drafted by the king's secretaries, an early form of public communication that spread the news from Westminster to York, Exeter, and beyond. Town criers in market squares read aloud the articles of Anne's coronation charter, emphasizing her new status and her role in the spiritual as well as political life of the realm. Amid the festivities, Anne's pregnancy, announced just weeks before, added an air of hopeful expectancy. Cries of "Long live the Queen and her heir," echoed in the marketplace, and children were given dolls dressed in miniature Tudor velvet to symbolize the coming prince. In private audiences, Anne assured Henry of her unwavering commitment. "Your realm's hope rests within me, and I shall strive to bear the son whose birth shall secure your dynasty." These words, though simple, carried profound significance. They affirmed that the new queen would place the nascent Church of England at the heart of national identity, using faith as the bond that held together the realm in turbulent times. At the same moment, Henry strengthened his personal authority through legislative and administrative actions. He issued new statutes stripping the Pope of all juridical powers in England and reinforcing the Act of Supremacy passed the previous September. Any cleric or layman who dared to appeal to Rome for redress faced penalties ranging from fines to loss of ecclesiastical benefices. Among those most impacted were Cardinal John Fisher, Bishop of Rochester, and Sir Thomas More, the former Lord Chancellor, both staunch defenders of papal primacy. Fisher was imprisoned in the Tower on the 5th day of June, while More resigned his chancellorship later that month, unwilling to swear the required oath acknowledging the king's supremacy over the church. The accession of Anne as queen therefore symbolized more than a dynastic union. It stood as a triumph of the reform movement that had been quietly gaining strength in certain circles of English clergy and laity. In recognizing Anne's marriage and elevating her to the throne, Henry had effectively cemented the break with Rome. Within months, monastic houses across the countryside would be dissolved, their lands absorbed into royal estates. Cortes in Spain and the papal curia watched anxiously as England remade its ecclesiastical infrastructure, appointing bishops and archbishops beholden to the crown rather than to the Vatican. Through all this, the people of England, though often weary of political upheaval, found themselves caught up in a wave of nationalistic fervour. Songs celebrating the new church were sung in taverns. Sermons preached in parish churches spoke of the king as both sovereign and guardian of the true faith. Anne's coronation was remembered not only as a marital event, but as a watershed in England's religious history, a moment when dynastic ambition and spiritual reform converged to create a distinctive English identity, one that no longer looked to Rome but to the swelling power of the Tudor throne. In the hushed afterglow of those grand ceremonies, the realm stood transformed, poised on the brink of a new era in which the intertwining of royal will and religious life would redefine the very character of a nation. Not long after Anne's triumphant coronation, the first fissures in royal harmony began to emerge. Despite her status as the emblem of England's religious reformation, Queen Anne soon found herself unable to provide the male heir so desperately needed. Between the autumn of the year 1533 and the winter of 1535, she suffered 3 consecutive miscarriages, each loss a new blow to her standing at court. The precise dates are recorded in the royal household accounts. A miscarriage at approximately 2 months' gestation in the latter days of January 1534, another in mid-July of the same year, and a third in the first week of February 1535. Each time, physicians and midwives attended her in her private chambers at Whitehall Palace, but none could alter the cruel decree of nature. With each failed pregnancy, the weight of expectation grew heavier upon Anne's shoulders and darker in the corridors of the Tudor court. In a society that viewed a daughter's birth as little more than a political inconvenience, her inability to deliver a son stirred whispers of divine displeasure. Courtiers recalled that Anne herself had once invoked the words "Le temps viendra," the time will come, in her treasured Book of Hours. Yet, as the months passed without a surviving male, those prophetic lines took on a desperate irony. At the same time, a faction of conservative nobles, staunch supporters of Catherine of Aragon, and loyal to the old faith of Rome, saw in Anne's struggles an opportunity. They conspired to undermine her influence by spreading salacious rumours of her supposed licentiousness. Among their chief targets were Sir Thomas Culpeper and Mark Smeaton, 2 handsome courtiers who had earned Anne's favour in private audiences. Letters intercepted by palace officials hinted at assignations in the royal apartments. Whispers in the Privy Chamber suggested that Anne's affections were not confined to the king alone. These allegations, though never substantiated in open court, eroded her reputation among those who had once hailed her as the new moon of Tudor hope. Henry himself grew wearied by the endless intrigue. The jovial warmth that had once drawn foreign ambassadors and delighted the common folk of London began to fade. He devoted himself once more to the hawks and hounds, tracking deer in Windsor Great Park with his trusted falconers, or laughing boisterously over games of real tennis in the royal courts. His appearances beside Queen Anne became increasingly sporadic. When he did visit her apartments, his conversation often turned to statecraft rather than courtly sentiment. Observers at Whitehall noted the change. The Queen's chamber, once resplendent with tapestries and flower garlands, now sat in sombre silence. One diplomat recorded, "Her ladies, once dozens in number, have been reduced to a handful, and the laughter that accompanied morning prayers has all but vanished." The grand banquets that had marked Anne's early days as queen, lavish spreads of peacock, venison and spiced wine were scaled back, with fewer guests and more wary glances exchanged at the high table. Rumours of a marital coup grew louder. Some whispered that Henry might seek to discard Anne as he had Catherine, once he discovered another candidate capable of fulfilling his dynastic imperatives. Others speculated that the king's great ministers Thomas Cromwell and Thomas Cranmer were manoeuvring to protect Anne for the time being, but at the cost of their own standing. Even Anne's most ardent supporters acknowledged that her star was dimming. The same corridors that had once echoed with her music now carried muted echoes of anxiety. In public, Henry and Anne maintained an outward show of unity whenever summoned for official functions. They appeared together at the opening of Parliament on the 5th day of February, in the year 1535, processing side by side beneath banners proclaiming "Viva Rex et Regina." Yet the applause that greeted them rang hollow, for the realm sensed that the alliance between king and queen had shifted from one of impassioned romance to a pragmatic bond strained by unfulfilled hopes. Thus, the palace that had witnessed Anne's meteoric rise now stood as the stage for her gradual eclipse. The Queen's Lady Chapel, once her sanctuary of prayer, became a place of private lament. The painted chamber, once alive with masque and dance, fell into quiet disuse. In the hushed hush of courtly expectation, the tragic pattern of Tudor politics played out anew. A queen's failure to bear a son could spell not only her personal heartbreak, but the unravelling of alliances, the resurgence of old loyalties, and the slow collapse of a love that had once promised to reshape the destiny of a kingdom. In the languid days of May, in the year 1536, the tide of fortune that had once lifted Anne Boleyn to the pinnacle of power and affection at Henry VIII's court reached its calamitous end. It was little more than 2.5 years since the events of the 1st of June in 1533, when Anne had ascended Westminster Abbey's coronation dais as Queen of England, blessed, at least in England, by the marriage declared valid through Archbishop Thomas Cranmer's decree of the 23rd of May. Now she faced the ultimate reckoning: confess her purported sins or meet death by the blade. The story begins with Anne's children. On the 7th day of September, in the year 1533, she had given birth to her first and only living child, the Lady Elizabeth, whose survival was itself a sign of grace after so many losses. Yet in the bitter winter that followed, tragedy struck again. On the 29th day of January in 1536, Anne endured a miscarriage in her private chambers at Whitehall Palace, a loss so profound that it echoed through the halls in hushed corridors and tear-stained linens. The midwives recorded her grief, and the king's physicians noted the physical toll. Fevered nights, weakness so severe she could barely rise from her ornamented bed. By the spring of 1536, the strain upon court and crown was palpable. Henry's patience, already tested by failed pregnancies and the inexorable demand for a male heir, snapped. In the beginning of May, the king issued his ultimatum. Queen Anne must confess to adultery and treason, thereby acknowledging her supposed betrayal of both husband and realm. Otherwise, she would die. The charges were grave. Adultery with Sir Thomas Culpeper and Mark Smeaton, trusted courtiers who had once shared her confidence, treason against the king, and complicity in a plot to poison the sovereign himself. Rumours swirled that these liaisons had been more political than carnal, that they served as pretexts for Anne's downfall, orchestrated by factions yearning to restore Catherine of Aragon's bloodline. By the 2nd day of May, Anne was confined to the Tower of London, the very walls that had witnessed her rise now echoing with her silent laments. She was offered a chamber of relative comfort, but comfort did little to soothe the heaviness in her breast. A small prayer book remained on her bedside table, its gilded pages a reminder of earlier days when she had penned the prophetic words, "Le temps viendra." Now, Those words haunted her as she awaited trial. The proceedings began on the 15th of May with preliminary hearings before the King's Council. Witnesses summoned included those from Anne's inner household, men and women whose loyalty had once been pledged to her. Under pressure, some say coerced, several testified that they had seen Anne and her alleged paramours in compromising situations. The testimonies, though inconsistent and scant on detail, provided the veneer of legality for the charges. On the 17th day of May, a formal trial convened before the Lords of the Court of King's Bench presided over by the Duke of Norfolk and Lord Admiral Thomas Howard. The jury, composed of noble peers, heard the indictments read aloud. Adultery with multiple gentlemen of the Royal Privy Chamber, a conspiracy to kill the king by poisoning, and a betrayal of the realm in collusion with foreign powers. Anne, wearing a simple kirtle beneath her customary black gown, maintained her composure and proclaimed her innocence, pleading that a queen should be condemned by clearer proof. Yet the verdict arrived swiftly, guilty on all counts. The sentence, death by executioner's blade rather than axe, was deemed a special pardon for one of noble birth. Nevertheless, Anne's fate was sealed. Hope, once as vivid as the Tudor rose, wilted in the face of inescapable judgment. At dawn on the 19th of May, Anne was led from her Tower lodgings to the scaffold on Tower Green. The spring air carried the faint murmur of guards and the rustle of courtly gowns assembled beyond the ban of commoners. With measured footsteps, she ascended the platform beneath a canopy embroidered with the royal arms. In her hand she carried a single prayer book. On her lips, a final prayer for mercy. The executioner, a skilled swordsman brought from Calais, raised his two-handed sword. In a motion so precise it seemed rehearsed, he delivered the coup de grace, severing Anne's head from her shoulders in a single stroke. The date was etched into the annals of history, the 19th day of May in 1536. Thus fell Anne Boleyn, the Tudor Rose, whose union with Henry had bent the course of church and state. Her legacy lived on through her daughter Elizabeth, who would ascend the throne in the autumn of the year 1558, becoming one of England's most revered monarchs. Yet Anne's imprint on her nation was more than dynastic. Through her marriage's tumultuous unfolding, she had catalyzed the permanent severance of England from the papal yoke, giving birth to a reformed Church of England. In the tragedy of her end lay the seeds of a religious and political transformation whose echoes would resonate for centuries to come, shaping the very identity of a kingdom once torn between devotion to Rome and allegiance to its own sovereign. After the tragic death of Anne Boleyn on the 19th of May in the year 1536, England entered a period of profound political and religious turmoil. Her only surviving child with Henry VIII, the Lady Elizabeth, was immediately styled Princess of England and transferred to the care of her grandfather, Thomas Howard, Duke of Norfolk, at Greenwich Palace. There, under the strict supervision of the young Duke's household, Elizabeth's earliest years unfolded within the shadow of her mother's erased reputation. In official chronicles, Anne's name was struck from court annals. Her memory survived only in whispered conversations and the few court documents that could not be expunged. Elizabeth's education commenced in the autumn of the year 1536, when she was but 3 years and 2 months old. Tutors renowned for their learning were appointed to instruct her in the languages deemed essential for a princess of her station. She studied Latin 5 days a week, conquering the declensions and conjugations that formed the foundation of scholarly discourse. As she grew older, lessons in Greek were added at the age of 7, and by the time she reached her 8th birthday, she was conversant in both French and Italian, having mastered the courtesy and subtleties of continental courts. Music and poetry were integral to her routine. She learned the lute and virginal, practiced hymns and madrigals, and composed verses in a neat, legible hand. In mathematics, Elizabeth tackled arithmetic and the rudiments of geometry, often working with an abacus in the morning hours before chapel. Her Christian history lessons covered the early church fathers and the ecumenical councils, with a focus on the writings of Augustine and Jerome. This comprehensive curriculum was designed not merely to cultivate her intellect, but also to instill in her a sense of moral and spiritual responsibility. Despite the absence of her mother's guiding presence, Elizabeth internalized a spirit of resilience and independence, traits that contemporaries later attributed to Anne's own resolute character. The Tudor court, however, remained a perilous environment. As Elizabeth matured, she witnessed a succession of monarchs and the violent shifts in religious policy that accompanied each reign. When Henry VIII died on the 28th day of January in the year 1559, Elizabeth was in her third year of adolescence. Her half-brother Edward, Duke of Somerset, ascended as King Edward VI under the regency of John Dudley, Duke of Northumberland. During Edward's reign, Protestant reforms accelerated. The Book of Common Prayer was mandated in 1559, and communion in both kinds was introduced. Elizabeth, then aged 11, observed the suppression of images, the removal of altars, and the influx of reformers from Geneva. These upheavals taught her the precarious balance between conviction and political necessity. When Edward died on the 6th day of July in 1553, aged just 15, the throne passed briefly to Lady Jane Grey, and then, after 9 days of crisis, to Mary I, daughter of Henry VIII by Catherine of Aragon. Mary, a devout Catholic, restored papal authority and reopened monasteries. Protestants were persecuted under the heresy laws, and nearly 300 were executed over her 5-year reign. Elizabeth, in her early 20s, kept her distance, maintaining a studied neutrality that preserved her life and her claim to succession. She attended Mass in private chapels, yet discreetly read Protestant texts by candlelight. These experiences deepened her appreciation for religious moderation and caution against fanaticism. On the 17th of November, in the year 1558, Queen Mary died at the age of 42, and Elizabeth, now 25, was proclaimed Queen Elizabeth I. Her inaugural speech at the Tower of London demonstrated the political acumen she had honed. She reassured her subjects that she would govern according to the laws and liberties of England, without favour to any party. In the months that followed, Elizabeth pursued a policy of religious settlement that blended elements of Protestant doctrine with traditional ceremonial. The Act of Supremacy, in 1559, reinstated royal authority over the Church, while the Act of Uniformity that same year required attendance at the Church of England's services but allowed for some latitude of belief. Throughout her reign, Elizabeth balanced the interests of the reformers and those who longed for a more Catholic expression of faith. She retained bishops who had served Mary when they accepted the oath of supremacy, and she maintained vestments and altars to appease moderates. Her famous injunction to her bishops to prefer neither Puritans nor Papists, but to seek unity without uniformity, reflected the lessons learned in her turbulent youth. Under her careful stewardship, England enjoyed relative religious peace for 4 decades, a remarkable respite after generations of convulsive change. In this environment, Elizabeth's character matured into that of a sovereign who valued prudence above zeal, compromise above extremism. She drew on the independence instilled in her by her mother's memory and the political savviness honed in the court's perilous shifting sands. From her earliest days in Greenwich, through the reigns of her half-brother, half-sister, and finally her own, Elizabeth absorbed the necessity of balance between old loyalties and new convictions, between personal belief and public duty. It was this measured approach that enabled her to avoid the bloodshed that had marred the era of her predecessors, and to solidify the moderate Protestant settlement that endured well beyond her death on the 24th day of March, in the year 1569. When Elizabeth I officially ascended the throne on the 17th day of November in the year 1558, she inherited a kingdom fractured by decades of religious turmoil. The passing of Queen Mary on that same day marked the end of 5 years in which England had been reconciled with Rome, only to be torn apart again by Catholic restorations and the persecution of Protestant ministers. Elizabeth, aware of the heavy legacy left by her father Henry VIII and her mother Anne Boleyn, faced the formidable challenge of healing those ancient wounds. Her first priority was to establish a religious settlement that would unite both Catholics and Protestants under a single national church, thereby stabilizing the crown and restoring public confidence in royal authority. Early in the spring of 1559, Elizabeth summoned Parliament to Westminster. There, on the 21st day of April, she granted her royal assent to the Act of Supremacy, formally entitled An Act for the Assurance of the Queen's Royal Power over all estates and subjects within her dominions. This legislation reasserted that the monarch was the supreme governor of the Church of England, a title Elizabeth chose to soften the blow to Catholic sensibilities by emphasizing governance rather than spiritual headship. The Act of Supremacy also required every bishop, clergyman, and royal official to swear an oath of allegiance to the Queen as head of the Church, a solemn pledge that, if refused, carried the penalty of deprivation of office. Only a few weeks later, on the 19th day of May in 1559, Parliament passed the Act of Uniformity. This companion statute mandated that all subjects attend church services according to the rites set forth in the Book of Common Prayer. Those who failed to present themselves at least once every quarter faced fines of 12 pence, an amount equal to 1 shilling in contemporary coinage. The Act preserved certain traditional elements, such as vestments and the use of altars, while maintaining the doctrine of justification by faith alone and the primacy of Scripture. English, rather than Latin, was declared the language of divine service, ensuring that worshippers could understand the liturgy without the mediation of a priest or a translation. Elizabeth's strategy of religious moderation, later dubbed the via media, proved politically astute. By retaining familiar ceremonial practices, she placated conservative clergy and landed gentry who feared radical reform, while affirming the theological principles championed by reformers. The Queen appointed moderate bishops such as Matthew Parker in Canterbury and Edmund Grindal in London, both of whom had served under Mary but were willing to swear the oath of supremacy. Parish priests were granted the right to administer communion in both kinds, a concession to Protestant sensibilities. Yet the sign of the cross was retained in baptism and during services of matrimony and burial. Through these measures, Elizabeth struck a delicate balance that prevented any single faction from gaining an overwhelming advantage. On the diplomatic front, Elizabeth navigated a complex web of European powers. Initially, she maintained cordial relations with Spain and France, mindful of their influence over continental Catholic forces. For nearly a decade, from 1559 until the summer of 1567, English galleys traded woolen cloth for Iberian wine, and envoys exchanged flattering correspondence with King Philip II and King Charles IX. Yet when the Spanish ambassador Don Pedro González de Mendoza hinted at a Catholic crusade to depose the Protestant queen, Elizabeth responded by strengthening her navy. She authorized the construction of new warships at Deptford and Woolwich, and increased the royal budget for maritime defence by £50,000, an extraordinary sum in contemporary terms. Her foresight proved justified when, in the year 1588, King Philip assembled the Spanish Armada. Though that event lies beyond our current focus, the preparations undertaken by Elizabeth in the preceding decades laid the groundwork for England's ultimate victory. The Queen's long reign, often called the Golden Age, saw not only naval triumphs, but also the flourishing of arts and commerce. Playwrights such as William Shakespeare and Christopher Marlowe penned works that resonated throughout Europe, while the chartering of the English East India Company, in the year 1569, opened new channels of trade with Asia. London's docks bustled with ships carrying spices, silk, and exotic goods, and the English merchant fleet grew to 300 vessels by the close of Elizabeth's reign. Underlying these accomplishments was the deep imprint left by Anne Boleyn, whose bold stand against papal authority had set the stage for Elizabeth's religious settlement. Though Anne's life ended in tragedy in May of 1536, her influence endured through her daughter's policies. Elizabeth's embrace of moderate Protestantism, her genius for political compromise, and her emphasis on royal supremacy in matters spiritual, derived in no small part from the circumstances of her birth and her mother's ambitions. By forging a church that owed its allegiance to the crown rather than to foreign prelates, Elizabeth honoured Anne's legacy and secured England's path toward an independent national identity. Thus, when Elizabeth I passed away on the 24th of March, in the year 1569, she left behind a realm transformed. The Church of England, with its blend of ceremony and scriptural authority, stood as a testament to the strategic vision she had inherited from her parents. Under her guidance, England emerged as a maritime and cultural powerhouse. The Golden Age that blossomed in the late 16th century owed much to the reforms initiated by her father and mother, reforms that Elizabeth had refined and sustained. In the annals of history, Elizabeth's reign shines as proof that the seeds sown by Henry VIII's dynastic disputes and Anne Boleyn's tragic fate could, under the right leadership, yield a flourishing kingdom defined by moderate faith, robust governance, and enduring national pride. From the early 17th century onward, the figure of Anne Boleyn began to re-emerge from the shadows of Tudor scandal, first as a symbol of romantic heroism and later under the scrutiny of modern historians. In the centuries immediately following her death in 1536, accounts of her life were largely shaped by polemicists, either vilifying her as an immoral schemer or venerating her as the catalyst of England's Reformation. Yet it was in the early decades of the 17th century, as the intellectual currents of Renaissance humanism gave way to Romanticism, that writers such as Romain Rolland and Victor Hugo rehabilitated Anne's image. Rolland, in his plays of the late 1800s and early 1900s, portrayed her as a pioneering female spirit, an agent of change who boldly defied patriarchal constraints to pursue her own destiny. Hugo, in essays composed in the mid-19th century, hailed her as the goddess of reform, a courageous figure whose personal convictions anticipated the social revolutions to come. Romantic writers emphasized Anne's independence and intellectual vivacity. They described her as a woman of modern sensibilities, fluent in multiple languages, skilled in diplomacy, and adept at navigating the power structures of the court. Feminist scholars of the early 20th century embraced this depiction, noting that Anne's refusal to accept a purely ornamental role paved the way for later arguments about women's political agency. Anne learned from the courts of Brussels and Blois, engaged with the theological debates of her era, and corresponded with leading humanists, all before her marriage to Henry VIII in January of 1533. In this light, she appeared less as a mere royal consort and more as a consummate political actor wielding influence through intellect as much as through intimacy. Yet even as admiration grew, so too did critique. Some historians and biographers cast Anne as an archetype of Machiavellian ambition, calculating, ruthless, and indifferent to the suffering she caused. 17th and 18th century gossips accused her of exploiting relationships with courtiers like Sir Thomas Culpeper and Mark Smeaton, not only for passion, but to consolidate her hold on power. Scattered correspondences and diary entries from courtiers suggest a woman who could be mercurial and demanding, traits that served her rise but invited resentment when fortunes shifted. Portraits from the period, often tinted with the red hue of scandal, depicted Anne with sharp features and a steely gaze, emphasizing her perceived manipulative prowess. It was not until the advent of modern historiography in the 20th century that scholars began to reassess Anne's life with greater nuance. Archaeological investigations and document studies at the Vatican Archives and the Royal Archives in Windsor Castle have clarified many misconceptions. For instance, interrogations and depositions used at her trial in May of 1536, long cited as proof of multiple adulteries, have been re-examined and found to reflect coerced testimony rather than reliable eyewitness accounts. The handwritten confessions of Sir William Kingston, the Lieutenant of the Tower, and the orders issued by Thomas Cromwell, now available in the Lambeth Palace Library, reveal a judicial process driven by political expediency. Historians such as Eric Ives and Retha Warnicki demonstrated that the charges against Anne were likely fabricated to remove her as a barrier to Henry's desire for a new marriage and a male heir. The study of surviving Book of Hours manuscripts and Anne's personal prayer books preserved in the British Library and the Bibliothèque Nationale de France has illuminated her genuine piety. Marginalia in her own hand, including the prophetic phrase, Le temps viendra, align with the devotional practices of a devout Christian rather than the image of a calculating libertine. These devotional items, dated to around 1520 and 1522, show careful wear consistent with frequent personal use, indicating Anne's sincere engagement with spiritual life. In recent decades, interdisciplinary approaches have taken hold. Feminist historians, cultural anthropologists, and literary critics collaborate to place Anne within the broader context of 16th century gender norms and political structures. They note that Tudor queenship itself was an evolving institution, offering limited but real avenues for influence. Anne's exercise of patronage granting offices, advocating for reformist preachers, and promoting scholarly works mirrored practices employed by her mother-in-law, Catherine of Aragon, and by other noble women of the era. The differences lay less in ambition than in the outcome. Anne's dramatic fall from favour and execution on the 19th of May in 1536 overshadowed her accomplishments. Today's consensus views Anne Boleyn less as a scandalous temptress or a ruthless upstart, and more as a complex figure caught between transformative religious currents and dynastic imperatives. She emerges as a victim of the era's volatile power dynamics, a woman whose personal and political fortunes hinged on her ability to navigate the shifting allegiances of court and church. In the crucible of Tudor politics, Anne's life and death became catalysts for England's definitive break with Rome, yet her memory was long obscured by the very forces she helped set in motion. Thus, through archaeological evidence, archival research, and critical reinterpretation, modern scholarship has at last begun to disentangle Anne Boleyn from the web of half-truths that once defined her legacy. Where once she was caricatured as either saint or sinner, she is now appreciated as a multi-dimensional individual, a reformist queen, a devout Christian, and a courtly strategist whose life encapsulated the tensions of an age in flux. In recovering Anne's true story, historians have also illuminated the broader narrative of Tudor England, demonstrating how personal ambition and spiritual conviction intersected to reshape a nation's identity. From the 1960s onward, Anne Boleyn's image has enjoyed a vivid revival in popular culture, reappearing in television dramas, historical novels, and documentaries that invite each generation to re-examine her life through fresh lenses. In 1970, the British Broadcasting Corporation aired The 6 Wives of Henry VIII, a 6-part series starring Genevieve Bujold as Anne, which brought her story to millions of viewers and established a template for sympathetic portrayals of her strength and vulnerability. In the years that followed, writers like Philippa Gregory renewed this fascination in her novel The Other Boleyn Girl, first published in 2001, offering a romanticized interpretation that cast Anne as both political player and passionate protagonist. These varied retellings reflect modern society's craving for historical figures who are neither wholly virtuous nor entirely villainous, but rather complex characters balancing frailty with courage, error with greatness. Fashion historians and costume designers have likewise played a critical role in animating Anne's world for contemporary audiences. Through careful study of surviving portraits, inventories, and tailors' accounts from the early 1600s, scholars have reconstructed the distinctive silhouette of her era. The French hood, stiffened farthingale, and slashed sleeves that marked the height of Tudor court fashion. Exhibitions at the Victoria and Albert Museum in London have showcased replicas of the sumptuous fabrics, velvet, damask, and silk brocade, embroidered with Tudor roses and her own insignia. These tactile displays allow visitors to appreciate the weight and texture of aristocratic dress, underscoring how Anne used her appearance as a form of political expression, signalling both piety and power. Academic conferences at Cambridge and Oxford universities continue to push the boundaries of Boleyn scholarship. In the summer term of 2015, an interdisciplinary symposium convened experts in early modern history, art history, and gender studies to analyze Anne's non-verbal communication, her posture in surviving miniatures, the gestures she employed in court portraits, and the placement of her hands in signing official documents. Papers presented at that meeting examined the subtleties of her known letters, including the few phrases penned in French, and contextualized them alongside diplomatic correspondence in Latin, revealing how Anne navigated the intricate power dynamics of Henry VIII's privy chamber. Documentary filmmakers and podcast producers have further broadened public engagement with Anne's legacy. Popular channels such as Real Royalty and the YouTube series Weird History have dedicated multi-episode arcs to the Boleyn narrative, often collaborating with university historians to ensure factual precision. In Royal Bloodlines, a 2-part special aired in 2020, experts discussed the recent re-examination of trial transcripts from May of 1536, demonstrating how certain testimonies were likely obtained under duress. Episodes of Weird History that feature Anne have attracted millions of views, blending archival illustrations, some sketched from 16th century manuscripts with contemporary commentary, that challenges viewers to question long-held myths about her character and motives. The surge of interest is not confined to Western audiences. In Japan, NHK produced a 2-hour drama in 2019 titled Kogo no Shouzo, Portrait of a Queen, in which Anne's story was framed against the broader theme of women's autonomy. Chinese streaming services have carried subtitled versions of BBC adaptations, spurring Mandarin-language discussions on forums about the parallels between Tudor court politics and dynastic intrigues in imperial China. Even in India, where historical dramas often center on Mughal and Maratha histories, recent series have opened with comparative reflections on royal marriages as mechanisms of statecraft, a nod to the universal resonance of Anne's story. Underpinning all these cultural expressions is the work of modern historiography, which treats Anne Boleyn not as a static icon but as a subject whose life must be interpreted within its fragmentary documentary record. Scholars emphasize that surviving sources, household accounts, ambassadorial dispatches, and ecclesiastical registers require careful cross-referencing to reconstruct a balanced portrait. In 2018, a team at the British Library published a digital edition of Anne's Book of Hours, complete with high-resolution scans and scholarly annotations of her marginal inscriptions, including the prophetic Le temps viendra. This project, supported by the Arts and Humanities Research Council, exemplifies the commitment to bring primary evidence before the public, allowing readers to engage directly with the artifacts once held in Anne's own hands. Thus, from elaborate television dramas to immersive museum exhibits, from scholarly conferences to global streaming platforms, Anne Boleyn's life continues to captivate and challenge. Each new interpretation invites audiences to consider her not merely as a footnote to Henry VIII's reign, but as a pivotal figure whose choices and whose fate shaped the religious and political trajectory of England. Through these varied portrayals, we see a woman of intellect and resolve, a courtly diplomat and a devout believer, whose legacy endures as a testament to the enduring power of re-examination in the telling of history. And so, as our tale of ambition, devotion, and transformation drifts softly to a close, we slow our steps and let the echoes of Tudor corridors fade into the hush of memory. Imagine the final candle flame guttering gently in Anne's private chamber, its warm glow casting dancing shadows on the ancient oak walls, until at last the light grows so faint that you can scarcely tell where lamp ends and darkness begins. In that moment, we are reminded that even the grandest dramas yield to the quiet passage of time, and that every story, no matter how turbulent, finds its rest in the stillness of reflection. What, then, is the message that lingers when the last footfall has sounded? Perhaps it is this: that human hearts, driven by hope and longing, possess both the power to reshape kingdoms and the vulnerability to be reshaped themselves. Anne's courage in the face of convention, Henry's struggle between duty and desire, and Elizabeth's resolve to heal a fractured realm all converge to teach us that true strength often wears the guise of compassion, and that progress may come at great personal cost. These are the values we carry forward: the conviction that faith can inspire, but must be tempered by mercy; that authority can unite, but must be wielded with humility; and that love, in all its forms, can both elevate and imperil. Now, as you settle beneath your own blanket of night, allow these lessons to wash over you like a soft breeze through a quiet garden. Feel the tension of the day slip away, leaving behind only the gentle assurance that every ending contains the seeds of renewal. Picture the roses of Anne's lost rose garden, their petals carried away on a sigh of wind, only to settle in richer soil somewhere beyond our sight, ready to bloom again in a new spring. And so we whisper goodbye to the echoes of palace halls and the shimmer of royal pageantry, letting the final images dissolve into the deep calm of your mind. Thank you for sharing this journey with us. Your presence gives purpose to our storytelling, and your imagination breathes life into every character we revive. If you have found even a moment's comfort or inspiration in these quiet reflections, we invite you to join us again for the next chapter of history's unfolding tales. Sleep well, dear listener, and may your dreams be suffused with gentle light and hopeful promise. And when you awaken, remember to subscribe to our channel so that we may welcome you back with more stories whispered in the softest tones, and share together the very best of our discoveries. Good night, and sweet rest to you.